Okay, I want to speak about a contentious subject, which is racism, but a little bit more specific, racism in East Asia. The reason I'm saying East Asia and not the whole continent of Asia is because you can never really generalize a continent, and also there is regional variation from country to country in Asia. Um, I'm talking about East Asia. I'm referring primarily to China, the Koreas, Japan, Taiwan. Um, and yeah, more or less that area. Because countries like Malaysia and India are very diverse anyway. So I think there's a difference in that. There's a few disclaimers I want to make before I continue with this. Firstly, everything I'm saying in this video is not based, I have to emphasize this, is not based on everyone. I am talking about individuals or trends as opposed to every single person. So if you are from that part of the world, please don't take it personally. I'm not slandering each and every single person, not for a second. I think that's the height of boneheaded stupidity, and I would never do it. Secondly, I am going to be absolutely truthful about my own experience. Um, and thirdly, this is just discussion. It is not intended to, start a cyber war or something. But I do believe the issues need to be discussed because I think this is not necessarily talked about as much as it should be in comparison to the way racism is discussed in the West. Part of the context in which I'm making this video is a video I watched a while back. It basically showed that a Western man somewhere in China, I'm sure I've mentioned this a few times, and this mob, basically, there's no other way to describe it, surrounded him and it got quite ugly. I mean, there was no serious damage, but it was still quite unpleasant to watch all because he'd supposedly had a confrontation with a woman. Now, we'll have to always be wary about videos. I don't know what happened. I wasn't there. I don't know if he was in the wrong or the right or whatever. But it did strike me as interesting because I am sure that if a Chinese man was accused of beating a woman, a Chinese woman, you would not get the same reaction at all. I'm pretty sure of that because there's plenty of videos showing Chinese guys abusing their significant others, and I wouldn't say there's public apathy, that wouldn't be true, because there are some decent people who do care, but certainly there is double standards when it comes to how foreigners are perceived and how Chinese are perceived, and definitely Chinese can get away with a lot more, which foreigners would be rounded up on for. So there's definitely double standards in this regard. There's no question about that. I've seen that not only that online, more importantly, I've experienced it firsthand, not against myself, but I've seen double standards of things that, smaller things that just wouldn't be accepted by Chinese. For example, being shortchanged because you're a foreigner, just little slights that I don't think would stand with a Chinese person. Um, there's absolutely double standards in that regard. Looking at China, and I'm mainly going to focus with China in this video because I haven't been to Japan or the Koreas, so I can't comment in detail about that. I was going to say or Taiwan. I know that's a contentious issue in itself because China, of course, sees itself as part of just another province of theirs. But there you go. I've been to China, so I'm mostly going to focus on China. Um, Firstly, it is important to look at historical context. Whereas countries like the United Kingdom, France, and Netherlands were built as seafaring nations, as trading nations, in fact, that could be said of most European countries. Um, so they've always been open countries in the sense of they've always had interaction with other groups of people, whether it be through their empires or whether it be through immigration. In the case of Britain, coming from the 1940s onwards. Um, there's always been interaction, so we've always had a diversity. In fact, in the case of Britain, not just modern colonialism and immigration, going way, way back to the various groups that spread across Europe and eventually migrated to the British Isles. In the case of China, historically speaking, China was always a closed off nation. And this doesn't mean that it wasn't diverse within itself, because you had lots of petty kingdoms. This is before the unification of China in about the first century AD. There were lots and lots of petty kingdoms. There was numerous bloody conflicts between the rival dynasties. Anyway, there is a point I'm making with all of this. There is a difference in history. China was closed off in a way that Western countries were not, and it only really opened in 1978. Let's put that into context. 4,000 years of history, it opened in 1978. So we're contrasting 4 millennia with just over 30 years. So I think it's going to take a very long time before the Chinese mentality changes. And what I mean by that, I'm not talking about every Chinese person. I'm talking about the characteristic of being inward looking. This is definitely a generation thing because young Chinese people tend to be a lot more worldly wise, open minded than their forebears, their ancestors, and this is understandable. It's how people are molded by the environment in which you're growing up in. So young Chinese today, I find, are for the most part worldly wise and open minded. Not everyone. I do have certainly encountered arrogant nationalistic types, but that's not everyone. Um, so that's an important thing to take into account. Um, I do find it striking that when racism occurs against overseas Chinese people, which is awful, I abhor racism and I'll always condemn it. And if it happened to any of my Chinese friends, I would be absolutely the first to be confronting the idiot who's doing it. But it is interesting that when racism occurs against Chinese people in the West, it's a huge issue for them and they protest and they make it, well, it's a huge issue. But when racism occurs in China, there are widespread denials of the problem. Usually, I'm not saying it's condoned, but it is trivialized to the point whereby it's seen as, oh, these people are just being rude. So, in other words, if you have a Chinese person with a very bad racist attitude towards outsiders, I'm not just talking about Westerners, I'm also talking about other Asian groups. Um, the attitude is generally seen as, oh, well, that person's being a bit rude. Like, oh, they're being a little bit naughty. It's a little bit like they have a bad attitude or something. It isn't seen in the light of racism. I'm not sure if there is even a word that translates directly from English to Chinese with our literal definition of racism. Certainly, racism is dealt with a lot more seriously in the West than it is in the East. I'm not saying it is necessarily allowed in the East. I'm not saying that, but I do think the taboo around it is much, much less. And yet, when people from Asian countries come to the West, and if they happen to personally experience racism, then it's just a huge issue. So it's almost like they're adapting to the Western taboo of what racism is. Um, there are numerous examples. There's many videos online of examples of racist attitudes in Asia. One of the most prominent recently was that guy in Taiwan who had to rant against a couple. Now, maybe this marks a sea change because there's several things different about that. Firstly, it went viral in a way other cases don't. Secondly, a lot of Taiwanese people were condemning the guy who done it, I'm pleased to say. And there was, a lot of people were saying it was disgraceful what he was doing and so on. So maybe, I don't know if that marks a sea change. Like I said, I haven't been to Taiwan, I haven't been to Japan or the Koreas. My impression from Japan and the Koreas is that they have a homogenous society that is seen in a few other countries. Even China is a lot more diverse. In the case of Japan and South Korea, they like 99.9% of Japanese people are ethnic Japanese. I know there's a few minorities like begins with H, I forget the exact word, but generally speaking, these are extremely homogeneous societies. Of course, cities like Tokyo and Seoul are international cities, so of course you'll have Western business people, but generally speaking, they do not have the diversity of London or Paris or New York City. Um, so with that, perhaps comes an acceptance of hostile attitudes to outsiders in a way that wouldn't be accepted in Western countries. Um, that is not to say for a second that all Japanese people are racist. I'm not. Please don't think I'm saying that because I'm really not. But I do think there is just a difference in terms of how it is viewed. Um, Another thing that irritates me is that when these issues are brought up, I've seen a few people online who come up with, "Oh, you Westerners done this, you Westerners done that. What about slavery? Yada yada yada," and they go into all the faults of the West. Well, firstly, there is a big difference, I think, in terms of honesty about past. I This may be a controversial point of view, but I believe Western countries are generally more open about their past than Eastern countries are. We know about slavery. We know about the exploitation of Native Americans. We know about the crimes of empire. But in China, for example, the darker elements of Chinese history are censored. Now, this is an irrefutable fact. That's just the way it is. So when people come out with these sort of counterclaims, I'm like, yeah, that's all true. But you know what? We acknowledge it. And another thing, in the West, there are strict laws dealing with racism. Now, I'm not an expert on the legal systems of countries in East Asia. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there are tough penalties in place for racist incidents, but I haven't come across that, and I've never heard of anyone being prosecuted for racially abusing a foreigner in the way they definitely would be here. So that is a few fundamental differences that need to be taken into account. So I'm going to wrap this up. If you're from that part of the world, I'd like to know your view. Do you think there is a problem with racism? And I mean racism. I'm not talking about people, don't trivialize it as people being rude. I'm talking about holding a hostile attitude to white people or black people or anyone who happens to be from another part of the world. Do you think there's a problem with that? My second question is, as far as you know, are there laws in place to deal with this? Um, yeah, those are my two open questions. The purpose of this video is not to shit stir it. It's not to try and say we are better than you or something like that. But it's just to discuss where there is a difference in attitudes, and I think there is. In my opinion, it needs to be taken more seriously. Now, to be honest, I don't want to give the impression that I believe that China or Japan or South Korea is really dangerous for foreigners. I don't believe that. Actually, I mentioned to speak about my personal experience. In my personal experience, I never suffered any major racist issues, but I did occasionally hear in a derogative manner older Chinese say Lao Wai under the breath, and I know it was derogative because of the tone in which they were saying it. That word Lao Wai can be good or bad. It means, it literally translates as old foreigner. It can be used in an amicable sense. In fact, I entitled my own journal, Journal of a Lao Wai, so I called myself that. I don't see the word in itself as offensive, and a friend of mine uh, insisted that it wasn't an offensive word. But I think it's a word where it depends in which context it's used. It's a bit like the word Fenian in Ireland. Traditionally, Fenian was actually a noble term. It meant a sort of hero. But over time, Ulster Unionists began to use it as a derogatory term. So today it has derogatory connotations. Although traditionally it was actually a sort of term of almost nobility or honour. So words can change over time. Um, yeah, that's all I have to say really. So like I said, in my own personal experience, I never uh, had any racist hassle. And certainly, in fact, in China, this is something that I should mention. I said I was going to wrap this up, but I think this is important to mention. it could be said that there is a kind of there's been much spoken about with young Asian women wanting to buy skin whitener and so on. Well, sometimes I've seen Asian people take issue with us for that. I think that's ridiculous. It's not, I think people should be themselves. They should be confident and comfortable in themselves. I happen to find um, Asian women are beautiful, from all ethnic backgrounds, dark or light. I find, female beauty is very diverse. You can find female beauty in all sorts of aesthetics. So I think that's ridiculous. It's up to them, of course. But some Asian people do believe that this is sort of it's almost like white worshipping, as they would call it, not my words. Um, Whereas darker skin is sort of frowned upon. Um, Someone I know, a friend of mine, and I'm not going to, talk too much about this because I respect her privacy, but she indicated that it would almost be offensive to be seen of as darker, to be compared to someone from south of the continent, and that's I've noticed is a very, very taboo issue in Asian society. I'm guessing, and I'm saying Asian society as a continent because this goes across countries. It partly connects to economics actually, because traditionally speaking, wealthy Asian women or those from a more privileged background, i.e., the king or the emperor's favorites, would be living inside the palace walls. Their skin would be untouched by the sun. They'd be whiter. Those toiling in the fields would be darker from the sun. So it also, I think, connects to social standing, which, despite being a communist country, actually has a lot of weight in China. So that needs to be taken into account. Final thing I want to say: in no way am I suggesting East Asia is racist. I'm not saying that, but I do believe there is a racism issue. I do believe there is an attitude problem that people don't really acknowledge. And as an outsider, it is noticeable. So let me know your thoughts. I hope people don't misinterpret this. If you're from that part of the world, I'm not talking about everyone. Okay, so please don't believe that I am. And I don't want to see comments like, "Oh, you people done this, you people done that." It's like I said, I totally acknowledge that. Okay, let's just stick to the issue at hand. And that, by the way, is something I would like to people to adhere to with all my videos. Thank you.